This information is brought to you by Charles Sturt University.
Alright,
no one's here in Port Macquarie either, so alright, well I'll walk you two through the digestive system. There we are, so starting at chapter 25. So the digestive system is an organ system that processes food, extracts nutrients and then eliminates the residue. So there's 5 stages involved in the process of digestion. So number 1 is ingestion, so this is the selective intake of food, obviously a voluntary occurrence. Number 2 is digestion, which is the mechanical and chemical breakdown of food into a more form that can be usable by the body, so it kind of breaks it down from food substance down into a bolus and then down into a kind of pasty liquid texture. Third stage there is absorption, which involves uptake of nutrient molecules into epithelial cells of the digestive tract and then into the blood and lymph. Fourth stage there is compaction, which is absorbing water and consolidating the indigestible residue into feces. And then number 5 is defecation, which is the process of the elimination of feces. So essentially today we're just probably going to get through maybe the first 1 or 2 or 3 stages. I'll get you up to the process of the stomach, and then from there we'll leave it and come back to it from next week. So types of digestion, so we've got both mechanical and chemical digestion. So mechanical digestion involves the physical breakdown of food into smaller particles. So this is achieved by cutting and grinding action of the teeth and the churning action of the stomach and the small intestine. So essentially the whole process of digestion is taking food and then just breaking it down into a substance that can then be broken down even further so we can extract the nutrients that we'll need out of it. Mechanical digestion also exposes more food surface to the action of digestive enzymes. So essentially by breaking down the food into smaller substances, there's greater than surface area around those food substances than for the digestive enzymes to come in and break it down further and then extract the nutrients and vitamins that we need from the food. So chemical digestion is a series of hydrolysis reactions that break dietary macromolecules into their monomers. So macromolecules include fats, proteins and carbohydrates, and then monomers are the smaller breakdown of those substances. So the macromolecules are a combination of building up on monomers, and then monomers are the breakdown of macromolecules. So you can see how they work together there. Chemical digestion is carried out by digestive enzymes produced in the salivary glands, produced in the stomach, the pancreas and also the small intestine. So the results of chemical digestion, so breaking down macromolecules into the smaller monomers, include breaking polysaccharides into monosaccharides, so poly meaning multiple, mono being one, proteins into amino acids, breaking fats into glycerides and fatty acids, and then also breaking nucleic acids into nucleotides. Some nutrients as well, on that note, can be readily absorbed from foods and don't need to be further broken down. So these can include vitamins, minerals, water and cholesterol as well. So once they're ingested, they can be just essentially automatically absorbed into the body without having to go down that enzymatic breaking down process. So moving on to the anatomy of the digestive system. So the digestive system is broken down into 2 anatomical subdivisions. These are 1, the digestive tract, and then number 2 are the accessory organs. So first one, the digestive tract is about 30 foot long and a muscular tube extending from the mouth down to the anus. And it includes the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine and the large intestine. And then parts of this digestive tract also make up the gastrointestinal tract, which is in the stomach and the intestines. So then we've got the accessory organs. So these are the teeth, the tongue, the salivary glands, the liver, the gallbladder and the pancreas. So the digestive tract is open to the environment at both ends, and then until food has actually been absorbed in by the cells of the body, it's still essentially considered as being external to the body. Okay, so as soon as food is absorbed into those cells of the body, it's considered as being external. So the layers of the tissue in the digestive tract. So the digestive tract works along the following basic structural plan. So it works through a mucosa, then a submucosa, then muscularis, and then a serosa. So from the most inner lining of the surface, we've got the mucosa. So this comprises of epithelial cells. Then we've got the lamina propria, and then the muscularis mucosae. And moving out further externally, we've got the submucosa, and then the muscularis externa, which is comprised of an inner circular layer and an outer longitudinal layer, and then the serosa, which is composed of areolar tissue and mesothelium. Alright, so here you can see we've got the mucosa, the submucosa, and then the muscularis externa, and then the serosa. So the mucosa is made up of epithelial cells, and then we've got loose connective tissue, which is the lamina propria, and then we've got the muscularis mucosae, which is a thin layer of smooth muscle. So as I go through these, it's going from the innermost layer and then working its way out to the outside, where it's surrounded by that serosa, so the kind of serous membrane that's all containing the stomach altogether. So then moving down from the mucosa into the submucosa. The submucosa is a thicker layer of loose connective tissue, and then in some places along the digestive tract, it can actually secrete lubricating mucus into the lumen, so into the hole that's essentially in the middle that the food passes down through. Then moving further externally, we've got the muscularis externa. So the innermost layer is the inner circular layer, which is essentially what makes up the shape, that star-like shape of the lumen, and then we've got the outer longitudinal layer, which is responsible for the movement and then the propelling of food. So if you think about the longitudinal striations of the muscle there, instead of being the circular shape, it's pushing the food down, so it's kind of following the direction of gravity and pushing it down. And then finally, that outer sheath around the outside here is the serosa. So this is a thin layer of areolar tissue, which is topped by a single sheet of mesothelium. So this begins in the lower esophagus and then ends just before the rectum for that serosus layer there. So for innervation, the digestive tract is innervated by the enteric nervous system, or the ENS. So this is a network of nerves that all work together to innervate the digestive tract. So it's a nervous network in the esophagus, the stomach, and the intestines, which regulate digestive tract motility, secretion, and blood flow. So there are over 1 million neurons involved in this ENS, the enteric nervous system, which is essentially more than what we have in the spinal cord. So it's highly functioning and able to do so in an involuntary capacity. So it functions independently of the central nervous system, but on top of this, the central nervous system can act or have additional impacts on top of the functions of the enteric nervous system. So it's not entirely part of the autonomic nervous system, because it does have some impact or function capabilities which are imposed on by the central nervous system. The ENS contains sensory neurons that monitor tension in the gut wall and conditions in the lumen. So this is composed of two networks of neurons. So the submucosal, which is the Meissner plexus. So this Meissner and Auerbach plexus are both German names named after their, autonomous in Germany from some time ago. So we've got the submucosal plexus, which is in the submucosa, so nice and easy in its name there. It controls the glandular secretion of mucosa. So essentially it controls how much mucus the glands secrete into the lumen, and also controls movements of the muscularis mucosae. So the movements of the muscularis, meaning it's essentially controlling the movement of the muscles relaxing and constricting to be able to force the food down the esophagus and down into the stomach and through the rest of the digestive tract. Then we've got the myenteric plexus. So this is a bunch of parasympathetic ganglia, and nerve fibres between the two layers of the muscularis interna. So remember how we've got the circular and then the longitudinal? So this is what this plexus here is kind of controlling. So it controls contractions of the muscles around the lumen. So whether they're expanding to allow food to pass through or contracting to try and push the food down further through the digestive tract. So regulation of the digestive tract. This occurs for motility and secretion of the digestive tract are controlled by neural, hormonal and paracrine secretions or paracrine mechanisms. So neurocontrol occurs in both short and long reflexes. So for the short myenteric reflexes, this occurs for stretch or chemical stimulation to act through the myenteric plexus. So the first plexus, if we go back there, here, that's involved in the contraction of the muscles around the digestive tract to try and force food down the rest of the body. And then the long or vagovagal reflexes are the parasympathetic stimulation of digestive motility and secretion. So these carry sensory signals from the digestive tract back to the central nervous system, and then the central nervous system kind of takes in all the information coming from the digestive tract and then sends efferent or motor command back down to the digestive tract, so to tell it if it needs to relax to allow for food to come in, or if it can contract because there's no food coming in, it doesn't need to process any food or a food bolus to send it down through the digestive tract. So that long reflex there is associated with signals going to and from the central nervous system essentially. Then we've also got hormones, which are controlling the secretion. So chemical messengers are secreted into the bloodstream and stimulate distant parts of the digestive tract. So this includes the secretion of gastrin. So essentially these hormones are associated with, again, chemical messengers. So sending signals to prepare the digestive tract and the stomach for receiving food that's just been eaten. And then we've got paracrine secretions. So these are secretions that include things like histamines and prostaglandins as well. So these are chemical messengers that diffuse through the tissue fluids to stimulate nearby target cells. So they can work together to stimulate functions of the digestive system. So again, associated with local effects, where the hormones are a much broader effect and work around the rest of the body, where the paracrine secretions are just working locally and trying to diffuse into the tissue fluid to be able to act on the digestive tract in the area where they're secreted from. So then we've got the mouth, which is also referred to as the buccal cavity. The mouth functions for ingestion, so obviously the intake of food. Also works for taste and other sensory responses to food, including chewing and chemical digestion, so the breaking down of the macromolecules into monomers. It's also involved in swallowing, speech and respiration. So I'm guessing these functions by now you should already be somewhat familiar with. So it's made up of stratified squamous epithelium, which lines the mouth. So we've got keratinized protein layers in the areas that are subject to food abrasion, such as the gums and the hard palate, and then non-keratinized in other places, such as the floor of the mouth, the soft palate, and the insides of cheeks and lips. So essentially what we mean by keratinized is that it's got a layer of protective protein, essentially, that's preventing any external abrasions from occurring to it. So things like getting burnt by putting hot food in your mouth, or getting an abrasion from like a potato chip or something that's a bit rough. That's what we've got those keratinized areas in the mouth for. So they're keratinized so that we don't get subjected to areas of abrasion. Moving down, we've got the tongue, which is a muscular, bulky and agile and sensitive organ. This manipulates food between the teeth while avoids being bitten. This can extract food particles from the teeth after a meal and is sensitive enough to feel a stray hair in a bite of food. This is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So it's non-keratinized, meaning it doesn't have that hard protective film, that hard protective protein layer, that's the keratin. So it's made up of the lingual papilla. So this is bumps and projections of the tongue. So essentially they're the ones that made up the taste buds that are sensitive to sights. We've then got the root of the tongue, which is the posterior 1/3 of the tongue that occupies the oropharynx. And then the body of the tongue is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue that occupies the oral cavity. So what you'll find familiar with labelling the body of the tongue and the body of other elements around the human body is that the body generally is something that makes up the majority of that specific area of the body. So in the stomach, we've also got a body of the stomach too, so that's how it's kind of relative there. We've also got something called lingual frenulum or frenulum. This is just the fold that's underneath the tongue, essentially, that's holding your tongue onto the bottom of your mouth. Okay, so that's called the lingual frenulum. Not something that you need to remember, but something that might be interesting to note. Okay, and now we've got the teeth, which can also be referred to as dentitions. These masticate food into smaller pieces, which then make it easier to follow. And then remember before how I said that by breaking down food, you're exposing a greater amount of surface area, which then increases the action of the enzymes to break down the food substances and to pick up on those essential nutrients that we're getting out of the food, and then being able to eliminate or discriminate those essential nutrients and then separate them from the waste that are being digested as well. So of this, we have 32 adult teeth and 20 deciduous or baby teeth. So we have 16 in the mandible and then 16 teeth in the maxilla. So these are made up of incisors, which are the chisel-like cutting teeth used to bite off a piece of food. We've got canine teeth, which are pointed and act to puncture and shred food. We've got premolars, which are the broad surface for crushing and grinding. And then we've also got the molars up the back, which are have an even broader surface and are used for cutting and grinding. So the socket where the tooth sits in the bone is referred to as the alveolus. So this has a gomphosis joint between the tooth and the bone. So where the tooth sits in that alveolus there, the joint between the tooth and the bone is called the gomphosis. So the periodontal ligament is modified periosteum whose collagen fibres penetrate into the bone on one side and into the tooth on the other. So this anchors the tooth firmly into the alveolus, so the socket that holds the bone in place, and then allows for slight movement under the pressure of chewing. Then we've also got gingiva, which is gum, which covers the alveolar bone. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the different elements of the tooth there. So up the top bit, the bit that's kind of exposed to the external surface, is the crown. Then we've got the neck that sits in that the gum, and then the root that sits below that creates part of that the gomphosis joint between the tooth and the bone. So mastication is the process of chewing. So this breaks down food into smaller pieces to be swallowed, and then also exposes more surface for the action of digestive enzymes. So the more we break down food, the more surface area there will be, and then the more likely we are for our body to pick up on those, or to be able to digest it is easier for one, and then also to pick up on those essential nutrients that we need that can then be broken down or catabolized during metabolism to be able to pull it out and use it necessarily in the body as we need it. So this is the first step in mechanical digestion. So mechanical digestion just means the breaking down of food substances. This includes the tongue, the buccinator or the mouth, and the orbicularis oris to manipulate food. So the orbicularis oris there is just the muscle essentially that runs around the outside of the mouth. So oris just means it's a circular shaped muscle. So we also use the masseter and temporis to elevate the teeth and crush the food. So involved in mastication process, there's less thought processes involved, as we have, similar to the receptors that tell us that we need to drink water, we also have receptors in our mouth that tell us that we need to chew the food that's been presented in our mouth. So this triggers kind of an involuntary food process. So while it's a voluntary occurrence to put food in your mouth, it's somewhat involuntary to actually continue on the chewing process or the mastication processes. So saliva, we have both intrinsic and extrinsic salivary glands. So the intrinsic salivary glands are small glands that are dispersed amid other oral tissues, and the extrinsic salivary glands are 3 pairs connected to the oral cavities by ducts. So shortly with you I'll go through with what those extrinsic salivary glands are. So the functions of saliva is to obviously moisten the mouth. It can also begin the starch and fat digestion. So the breaking down of starch and fat begins as soon as you put food in your mouth. Saliva works to cleanse teeth and inhibit bacterial growth. It also works to dissolve molecules so they can stimulate the taste buds. And also moistens food and binds it together in the bolus to aid in swallowing. So the bolus is essentially just a ball of food that's been chewed up in the mouth and then is ready to be swallowed in the, the small chunks that it goes down in. That's referred to as the bolus. So the pH of saliva is 6.8 to 7.0, so it's relatively neutral. However, pH throughout the entire digestive tract would change quite dramatically. So once we get into the stomach and we look at stomach acid, you'll start to see how acidic that is and how much the pH of the body kind of changes and needs all those mechanisms that we spoke about yesterday to be in place to kind of oppose the mechanisms and try and bring the blood pH or body pH back to a normal resting level. So here are the external salivary glands. So we've got the parotid gland, the submandibular gland, and the sublingual gland. So starting with the parotid gland, this is located just anterior to the ears. This has a duct that passes over the masseter here. If you've heard of mumps before, this is when a virus in the body will send an infection to the parotid gland where it then become inflamed and swollen too. Then as we move down to the submandibular gland, this is located halfway along the body of the mandible, just in here. And the duct empties out onto the mouth on the side of the frenulum. So the bit underneath the tongue that attaches the tongue onto the bottom of the mouth, this is where you'll see the submandibular gland and the submandibular gland ducts. And then we've got the sublingual gland here. So this is located on the floor of the mouth and has multiple ducts that empty into the mouth behind the submandibular gland. Okay, so all of these glands here have tree-like branch extensions that are the ducts. So they've got glands and then the ducts, so the holes, that secrete the saliva into the mouth are called the ducts, and these are all kind of like tree-like or branch-like extensions of the glands itself. So the pharynx, that's a muscular funnel that connects the oral cavity to the esophagus and allows entrance of air from the nasal cavity to the larynx. So the digestive tracts and respiratory tracts intersect along this pharynx region. So it's made up of deep and superficial layers of skeletal muscle. So the deep layers are referred to as longitudinal layers, and the superficial layers are the circular layers. So circular muscles that force food downward during swallowing are referred to as the pharyngeal constrictors, and this is that superficial circular layer. So when not swallowing, the inferior constrictor remains contracted to exclude air from the esophagus. So this has the opposite action of the epiglottis. So if you can remember, during breathing, the epiglottis works to block off food, so it will prevent it from getting down through the trachea and into the airways. The pharyngeal constrictors do the opposite in that they exclude air from getting down into the esophagus. Okay, so you've got both kind of hands of the coin working down the back of the throat. So the esophagus is a straight muscular tube that's about 25 to 30 centimetres long. So the start of the esophagus up here is around the C5, C6 region of the body. It extends from the pharynx to the cardiac orifice of the stomach. So the cardiac orifice is just here, just in here. It's the lining or the entryway to get from the esophagus down to the stomach. That's referred to as the cardiac orifice. And it's named the cardiac orifice essentially just after its location because it's sitting so close to the heart. So the lower esophageal sphincter, or LES, this is where food pauses at this point because of restriction, which prevents the stomach contents from getting regurgitated, which protects the esophageal mucosa from erosive effect of the stomach acid. So it's just essentially a blockage way that stops stomach acid from getting back up and making a burn. This is stomach acid before, if you can remember what I said about blood pH changing dramatically. So the stomach acid is extremely acidic and can make a burn mark. So therefore we have these mechanisms in place to stop the process of that stomach acid getting anywhere else other than the stomach, where the linings of the stomach are essentially prepared for that strong acidity of the stomach acid. This is referred to as heartburn. So heartburn essentially has absolutely nothing to do with the heart. It's rather a burning sensation that's produced when stomach acid refluxes into the esophagus. Okay, so we've still got that non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, so essentially it's just not a firm surface. It can has room for movement. The walls of the esophagus are similar to the stomach linings that we spoke about before and include the mucus, the submucosa, and then the muscles that we described earlier. So the esophageal glands in the submucosa secrete mucus into the lumen. So the lumen is this, the white structure that's inside the circular process of the esophagus. So these are deeply folded into longitudinal ridges when empty, which give the star-like shape in the cross-section. Then we've got skeletal muscle in the upper 1/3, a mixture in the middle 1/3, and then only smooth muscle in the bottom 1/3. So the esophagus goes all the way down and then meets with the stomach at that cardiac orifice at about the T7 level of the spine. So that's about how long the esophagus is and how long the esophagus will sit. So it starts at C3, C4, or C4, C5 I think I said, and then meets down at the stomach at around the level of T7. So swallowing, also referred to as glutition, involves over 22 muscles in the mouth, the pharynx and the esophagus. So this is all coordinated in what's referred to as the swallowing centre. So the swallowing centre is a pair of nuclei in the medulla oblongata that coordinates swallowing. This is where communications are made with muscles of the pharynx and the esophagus by way of the trigeminal, facial, glossopharyngeal and hypoglossal nerves. So these are cranial nerves 5, 7, 11 and 12. However, you won't actually cover the different types of cranial nerves until you hit third year. So the buccal phase, so remember buccal is, or the buccal cavity is another word for the term mouth. So swallowing occurs in two phases. So first phase here is the buccal phase, so in the mouth. This is under voluntary control, where the tongue collects food, presses it against the palate forming a bolus and pushes it posteriorly. Food then accumulates in the oropharynx in front of the blade of the epiglottis. The epiglottis then tips the food posteriorly and slides it around through the laryngeal opening. So essentially the epiglottis kind of acts like the back of a tip truck. So it allows the food to tip down the back of the throat in through the esophagus. The bolus then enters the laryngopharynx and stimulates the tactile receptors and activates the next phase. The next phase of swallowing is the pharyngoesophageal phase. So the pharyngoesophageal phase is involuntary. So this is where those millions of neurons that we spoke about before start to come into play. So we've got those involuntary actions coming about. So these three actions prevent food and drink from re-entering the mouth or entering the nasal cavity or larynx. So first of these actions is where the root of the tongue blocks the oral cavity. Then we've got the soft palate rising and blocks the nasopharynx. And then the muscles pull the larynx up to meet the epiglottis, while the laryngeal folds close the airway. So by all of these three essentially working together, what they're doing is just blocking off the back of the throat so that food goes down and won't come back up again. So the food is doing its essentially working along the process of the digestive tract, and as the circular muscles and the longitudinal muscles around the outside are contracting to push the food down, this is where the tongue and then the soft palate all work together to stop it from coming back up again. So the food bolus is driven downward by constriction of the upper, middle and lower pharyngeal constrictors. This is where the bolus then enters the esophagus, stretches it and stimulates peristalsis. So peristalsis is essentially like a wave of muscular contraction that pushes food down ahead of it. Okay, so starting at step number 1, the tongue compresses food against the palate to form a bolus. So a bolus is just essentially a mashed up ball of food that's been masticated through the mouth and breaking down those food substances with the combination of saliva being present and creates the food bolus. Step number 2, the bolus passes into the pharynx, where misdirection of the bolus is prevented by those 3 steps that we just spoke about. So the tongue blocks the oral cavity, the soft palate blocks the nasal cavity and the epiglottis blocks the larynx. Number 3 is where the upper esophageal sphincter constricts the bolus and passes it downwards. Okay, so where you can see we've got relaxation occurring of the muscles down here, this is to allow the food to pass down further. And as the food passes down that esophagus, below it is relaxing while above it is contracting. So it's restricting the food getting passed back up again by restricting the size of the passageway essentially, so the food only has one option but to go down. 4th step there is peristalsis, which drives the bolus down the esophagus. The esophagus restricts above the bolus and dilates and shortens below it. And step number 5 is where the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes to admit the bolus into the stomach. So the same process is happening all the way around, where we've got the muscles on top are contracting, which are restricting the amount of size in the passageway, so food can't go back up, while below where the bolus is, the muscles in the passageways are dilating, so getting larger to allow the food to pass back through, and it's working along that process. Okay, so still on the topic of swallowing, so talking about peristalsis, so this is where that wave of contraction occurs, so the constant contraction of the muscles above the bolus down that esophagus pathway, and then the relaxation underneath where the bolus is to allow the food to continually move down. So this is a wave of muscular contraction that pushes the bolus ahead of it. This is entirely an involuntary reflex. So the ENS system that we spoke about before, this is where this will start to kick in, and it will be an involuntary reflex, however with some actions of the central nervous system kicking in and having some kind of influence on the process of swallowing. When standing or sitting upright, the food and liquids drops through the esophagus by gravity faster than peristalsis can keep up with it. This ensures you swallow regardless of your body position. So while we've got gravity, which is assisting in the process of swallowing food and moving it from the mouth down into the stomach, we've also got the muscles working around it, which will assist in the swallowing, which essentially means you can swallow even if you are standing on your head, because you've got the muscles contracting and they're contracting tight enough so that the food will then be able to push from the mouth and into the stomach if you're upside down. So liquid, such as water or juice or something like that, can reach the stomach within as little as 1 to 2 seconds, where food may take as long as 4 to 8 seconds. When it reaches the lower end of the esophagus, the lower esophageal sphincter relaxes to let food pass in through the stomach. So the way that I kind of remember this peristalsis swallowing process is thinking about there was a Mario Party game where if you put the treasure chest into the top of the pipes, you could move it around, and wherever the treasure chest would drop out, essentially that's where you won the coins. So the way that this swallowing process works is, if you think about the opening up of those like bright green pipe mazes, is like the relaxing of the muscles below it, and then this constricting above it is where essentially you're losing control of that treasure chest so you don't win the coins. Okay, so where you've got widening up below it to allow the treasure chest to move around, and the tightening up above it to stop it from getting to any other team members, or opposition players rather. So that was it in terms of talking through the digestive system. I'm going to leave it there for today. Just wanted to make a quick note as well about your presentations on Thursday for the internal students. So for you guys here in Bathurst, you need to make sure that you're dressed appropriately as well. And then for the guys that are out in Port Macquarie, that just means essentially you'll need to get changed up your 221 tutorial so that you can make sure that you're appropriately dressed and not in full exercise gear or tracksuits. Anyway, I'll pick up from this slide 24 next week, and then I'll make sure that I include and possibly upload a summary slide as well, just so you can fill in the blanks there, or just make a note when you're in class. Cool. All right. Thank you. Yeah.
Is everyone on this Thursday, or is it?
No, it'll be so the weeks of the presentation will be allocated randomly. So you'll find out essentially when you arrive on Thursday if you'll be presenting this week or next week. You just need to make sure that you submit your presentations on the Thursday and bring with you a hard drive or a USB to be able to present it. So you need to walk into class and plug your USB into the computer while also having it submitted on Easts as well.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep.
How much should we have to dress up?
Oh, don't go suit and tie. A nice shirt and pants will be enough. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you have a walk through mine if that's alright?
Yep.
Just to see if I'm on the right track.
Everyone else all good? You guys all good? Thanks.
So I've just got it here.
Yeah, click on that.
I'm not 100% sure if I've done enough work. I think I have, but I think I'm pretty well done.
Yeah. Should go into show me your presentation
Right,
mode.
yeah, how do I do that on here? I haven't been able to use this computer for so long. Here we
Slideshow?
go, play.
Oh, yeah.
So because I'm talking about inflammation, I'd talk about the lymphatic system
Yep.
first, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
In that bit, just because you've only got 5 minutes, focus on the lymphatic role with inflammation or fighting off pathogens entering the body, or what you said, your inflammation?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've still got that in there. It should be coming up soon. Should I talk about all that, or
No.
no?
No, that has nothing to do with inflammation.
Okay.
So just, I reckon, introduce the lymphatic system.
Yeah.
Say what it is and what its role is in inflammation. You don't need to tell me anything else about the lymphatic system
Yeah, okay.
except its role in inflammation.
Yeah. Then I was going to ask a question if the class knows what they are before I click it.
Yep.
Does that seem right?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, cool.
Maybe use, like, if you're going to talk about inflammation there, use a for instance. So if you're going to use that picture,
Yeah.
just say playing rugby on the weekend, roll
Yeah,
my ankle.
okay. Yep.
Yep. Alright, so this is more the immune system than inflammation.
Yeah, okay.
So find what particular white blood cells are associated with inflammation and why it occurs, instead of telling me about a pathogen that enters the body. So a pathogen enters the body if you get like a rusty nail in your skin.
Yeah,
and then
okay.
you get, that's a pathogen
Yep.
essentially. So because it's like getting rid of all of the little rusty bits in there that probably have bacteria
Yeah,
all
okay.
over it, that's a pathogen, where inflammation is something that occurs internally,
Yeah, okay.
like that picture there. So that's perfect.
Yep.
Focus on that and what's going on there.
Yep. Okay. And then that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
I just got that. I need to fix that slide up.
Yep.
Done.
Yep. So just include more about information and like use it for instance. So take your time to walk through. Okay, so on the weekend I played rugby, I rolled my ankle, and then the first thing I noticed was this happening. This is because there's say a rush of blood to their area or whatever it might be. Next one, so walk through the different stages of it. So it was first it started swelling up. And next stage was it went red, and or whatever the stages that it occurred in. So walk through each of the stages and just pretend that it happened to you, and then just say, okay, this happened. So rolled my ankle. First thing I noticed was it was swollen. It was swelled up, and then tell me about the process about why it swelled up. And then the next one was it got red and hot. It got red and hot because of the vasodilation of the blood vessels to bring essentially heat to the body or try and cool it down. And then you've got the next stage was pain. So you notice that there was pain, tenderness, couldn't walk on it. This is because my body was essentially telling me to avoid walking or putting pressure in the area so it could heal itself. But use actual like scientific terminology and stuff as well. So just walk through each of those steps. And then if you can spend maybe like a minute or so on each of those steps, then it's
you're pretty
done.
much done.
Yeah.
Nice. All right, thanks. So pretty much get rid of that slide there.
That's not inflammation, that's immunity.
Okay.
So it's from the same lecture, but different.
That's why I got confused, because I was going like I pretty much just went off the lecture slides of what I was putting in here.
So same lecture, but different response.
Okay. All right, thanks for that.
No worries.
See you later.
See ya.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Hi.
I thought you might be giving a documentary.
I am, yes.
Fran Pierce.
Hi, what's your name?
Fran Pierce, I'm Glenn Turner's sister.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Oh my God, I didn't know you were going to come.
Oh, didn't you? Greg was supposed to tell you.
Oh,
Yeah, and I've got like 10 family coming too, so I hope that's okay. From my
fantastic.
husband's side of the family, not my brother's side of the
I
family.
had no idea you were
Oh,
coming.
okay.
Thank you so much.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Wow, that's just giving the whole evening a bit of a different feel.
Oh,
actually.
is that okay?
It's great.
Okay.
It's wonderful. Yeah,
Good.
yeah, good on you. Thank you.
No problem.
Oh, okay.
Now, I'm just, Greg's going to meet me here, so
Yeah.
do you think it's easy enough for people to find it's not?
It's potentially not.
Yeah.
People in.
I mean, I found it, and I'm not conducted.
No,
So.
I think bring all the lights down. The house lights. That's it. Okay. Hello.
Expecting the big crowd?
I've got no idea. Fran, this is Bruce Bell.
Hello, Fran.
Yeah, Fran is the sister of the
Clinton.
isn't it? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Thanks for coming, Bruce. Yeah. Do you reckon, I think there might be tables. I was going to run home and get a trestle table. I could have platters of food on
Yeah,
it.
absolutely.
Yeah, all right. Hey, Bruce, now that you're here, can you help me carry the other side of the esky?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, do you mind holding the fort, Fran?
I don't mind at all. I'll wait up there.
Yeah.
So you were happy with it then?